Comrade Frater here, and I'm going to be reading an article from Project Syndicate, a magazine I've never heard of called Why Marx Was Wrong. Um, Carl Bildt wrote it. He is the Swedish culture, or was the Swedish cultural minister in around 2006. I don't know him personally, don't know anything about him. I was like 5 when this person was the cultural minister. But he wrote this very, very fun stink piece on Karl Marx near his 200th birthday. So we're gonna do this. Oh, wait. Oh, the 5th of May is his birthday, so he wrote this 4 days after his birthday. Okay. I looked up Karl Marx because I didn't know his birthday. Uh, but anyway, on the occasion of Karl Marx's 200th birthday, the co-founder of communism has received more than a few positive appraisals, even from Western leaders, but those arguing that Marx cannot be blamed for the atrocities that his ideas inspired should re-examine his ideas. Now, aside from this redundancy, um, he calls him the co-founder of communism, which, I mean Marxian socialism, but this guy ignores anarchism. He ignores utopian socialists before Marx. He ignores the reformists, the social democrats. Like, he ignores all of these socialist, in quotes, because social democrats are really just like left-leaning liberals, but he ignores all of the socialist history just to focus solely on Marx. And he does this throughout the article. He ignores Maoism, he ignores Leninism, he ignores fucking every socialist tendency just to throw darts at Marx. He'll mention Engels a couple of times when he needs to uh, mention the other supervillain, but solely focused on Marx. Um, Stockholm, the bicentennial of Karl Marx's birth, has occasioned a surge of interest in the man's work, complete with the unveiling of a statue in his hometown of Trier, Germany. At a celebration of Marxism in Beijing last week, Chinese President Jinping, sorry, I don't know, man, declared that like a spectacular sunrise, the theory illuminated the path of humanity's exploration of the law of history and humanity's search for its own liberation. What a lovely quote. Thank you. He would go on to claim that Marx pointed out the direction with scientific theory toward an ideal society with no oppression or exploitation, where every person would enjoy equality and freedom. Given that Xi's words were uttered in Marxist China, those in attendance had no choice but to agree with him. Yet, speaking in Trier on the same day, European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker offered a somewhat generous appraisal of his own. Today he stands for things which he not responsible for, and which he didn't cause, because many of the things he wrote down were redrafted into the opposite. So I want to talk about this. He doesn't mention that China is Maoist. He doesn't mention that, well, they're Maoist, they're Marxist Leninists, technically. And he goes on later, I think it might be in like the next paragraph, if not later, where he implies that state control over the economy is a Marxist concept, inherently, and I could be wrong, but I don't know if Marx advocated for particularly a command economy, and I don't think he did. So this article implies that the USSR's economic system is Karl Marx's fault, and it implies that through this article, it implies that Karl Marx wrote significantly on socialism when he really didn't. He wrote mostly about capitalism. So if you're going to be a Marxist, your primary critique is of capitalism. And that's why Xi talks about Marx being a scientific theory. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the claim that Marx is scientific necessarily. I agree that his ideology is generally empirical. Marx aims to analyze society and to, based on his analysis, formulate what is happening in our economy, um, in the capitalist mode of production. And so that's why Xi says it's a scientific theory. That's why most Marxists say this is a scientific theory. That's why Engels wrote a book, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, because that is the view that Marx had over his and Engels' version of socialism. But anyway, yeah, this quote by Jean-Claude Juncker, it's a good quote. I would assume he's talking about Leninists, or he might be he's probably a liberal. I don't know him at all, so that's an assumption. But he's probably a bit of a liberal, and so he's probably saying this in the sense that socialists have stolen Marx, and so I don't know. But you could interpret it as that the USSR command economy did that to Marx, or the oppressive regimes that used Marx did this, like, abused Marx's ideology. I mean, that could be what he's saying. I don't necessarily agree with that. That's just, you know. It is not entirely clear what Juncker meant by this. Marxism, after all, has inflicted untold misery on tens of millions of people who have been forced to live under regimes waving its banner. For much of the 20th century, 40% of humanity suffered famines, gulag censorship, and other forms of repression at the hands of self-proclaimed Marxists. In his speech, Juncker seemed to be alluding to the standard counter-argument that communist atrocities throughout the 20th century were due to some sort of distortion of Marxist thought, for which the man himself can scarcely be held responsible. Is there anything to this argument? Marx spent most of his life analyzing the political economy of the industrializing mid-19th century West, but his enduring relevance owes more to his ideas for the future, the implications they would have for society. In considering his legacy, this area of his thought cannot be ignored. Marx regarded private property as the source of all evil in the emerging capitalist societies of his day. Accordingly, he believed that only by abolishing it could society's class divisions be healed and a harmonious future ensured. Under communism, his collaborator Engels later claimed that the state itself would become unnecessary and wither away. These assertions were not made as speculation, but rather as scientific claims about what the future held in store. But of course it was all rubbish, and Marx's theory of history, dialectical materialism, has since been proved wrong and dangerous in practically every respect. The great 20th century philosopher Karl Popper, who he doesn't explain who that is at all, one of Marx's strongest critics, rightly called him a false prophet, and if more evidence was needed, the countries that embraced capitalism in the 20th century went on to become democratic, open and prosperous societies. So, I mean, I would disagree with that. I mean, this part. Because a lot of the third world is, like, under dictatorships because of, like, capitalism. The United States government has overthrown democracies like Chile, Iran, I believe, um, or similarly, like, have overthrown or tried to overthrow Soviet, like, or not Soviet, like actual Marxist-Leninist states like Cuba, it's like the fucking Bay of Pigs, right? But they do it in the name of democracy, when usually they overthrow the government, or the CIA overthrows the government and instates a dictatorship. Or there's basically economic dictatorships of other countries because like private corporations will buy out the resources of a company or of a country, and then like throw the country into massive amounts of debt, basically, on the basis of making that country profit. And it's like, to imply that capitalism, like, you could argue, even if you were like a social democrat and you were like, oh, capitalism could be like reformed, like, you work on the basis that contemporary capitalism sucks, and it really does. It really is only good for the first world, and even first worlders have a not so good time. And I know, like Jason Unruh and YouTubers like that would shit their pants hearing that, but it's true. Like, we do have it good in the first world, but there's so much bad shit happening all the time. Like the Patriot Prayer, um, like Patriot Prayer shit, like the rise of like proto-fascists in the United States is really just evident of the failure of our democratic system. And it's like, uh, it's a frightening because our government supports it. Now, I also wanted to get onto, besides that tangent and kind of mini rant, him mentioning Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science. Um, he just throws him in there. I don't know if this publication is a philosophy publication, but he just throws him in there without explaining Karl Popper. He just says, "Oh, he was opposed to Marx," and doesn't say what he was opposed to Marx on. Why? Because I haven't personally read Karl Popper's analysis of Marx, but I have a feeling it's going to be that Karl Marx's theory isn't really scientific. And he doesn't explain that. He implies that Marx's government is like, or Marx's ideology produces whack governments. And it's kind of an appeal to authority because he's not explaining why Karl Popper is opposed to Marx. He's just saying, "Oh, look at this famous philosopher guy. He was against Marx," and it's like, okay, how, why, where, when, why? Uh, as for these, I don't care. He just, I think, so with this, he doesn't, wait, is this the one where he, no, it isn't, okay. By contrast, every regime that rejected capitalism in the name of Marxism has failed. Uh, okay. And not by coincidence. That's not true though. There's China, North Korea. North Korea kind of barely. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily count it, but they're loosely socialist. What about Vietnam? Like, what about the Zapatistas in Chiapas? What about loosely Rojava? They're not Marxist, but you know what I mean. The Democratic Confederation in northern Syria. They're loosely socialist. Like, there are current contemporary socialist states and contemporary socialist movements that are successful. And there were socialist movements in the past that were going to be successful but were crushed by outside invasions. Because especially the early 20th century was the world, like, politics were so unstable. Like, there's other shit at play here than Marx's ideology, especially because it doesn't really dictate what a post-capitalist society is going to look like, minus like the dictatorship of the proletariat and each according to his need. Like, this guy doesn't explain this. It's just the point is he's just shitting on Marx, unnuanced opinions that aren't even specified, even criticize. Like, if you're gonna criticize Marx, at least do it in the meme way, because at least those are real criticisms. By abolishing private ownership and establishing state control of the economy, one not only depraves society, oh, this is where he does it, deprives society of the entrepreneurship needed to propel it forward, one also abolishes freedom itself. So he implies that the Soviet-style command economy, right here, establishing state control of the economy, he implies that the command economy is a Marxian idea, and I'm not sure if it is. I could be right. It could be actually one of Marx's ideas, but I'm not sure. So if it is, can you tell me? Because I don't think the command economy is. And even if it is, like, you can reject an idea that Marx says. Because he's a person. He's going to be wrong at times. He wrote a shit ton of stuff. And to say that, like, everything Marx said is the law, which is some Marxists will literally do, even though in reality it might not make sense. Like, no shit. So then he also goes on to say, like, entrepreneurship is freedom. Is fucking, what about in feudal times? What about, oh, but he would say feudalism wasn't freedom and capitalism is freedom. It's bullshit. Like, it's such bullshit. Even, like, basis of separation of church and state, like, our country can't avoid making appeals to religion, like the far right does the same shit. It's ridiculous. Like the freedom of speech can literally be limited on platforms by corporations, which makes sense legally, but it shouldn't be the case. And freedom of speech is such a nebulous term in the first place because no people don't understand it. They don't understand hate speech. They don't understand like speech that calls for violence, like or fighting words. Like so people don't understand what freedom is, and they just invoke it. Like the three liberal ideas, especially. Like, what does that mean? There's no. So I had to step away for a second, eat some blueberries, because my throat was being weird, and I was like having to whisper, because it's 7 in the morning. So, hopefully my voice doesn't give out. Um, I already talked about that. Dissent after the establishment of communism is impossible. By definition, any challenge to the new order must be an illegitimate remnant of the oppressive order that came before. I don't know why he says by definition, because this whole paragraph, like I talked about, can only be based in the premise of class reductionism. And if you take an intersectional approach to social analysis, and you analyze society not just on the basis of class struggle, but also on racism, how society is racist, sexist, other sorts of oppression. Not only that, but you come to recognize that a centralized economy isn't necessarily the best idea, then this paragraph is meaningless. But it does provide a good, I feel like, an okay criticism, not of Marxism, but of fucking USSR command economies. And again, like I just reread the last part of this article, and it's literally like the only problem is that he's just substituting the USSR for Marxism. Like he's using Marxism instead of the USSR, and that's silly. Thus, Marxist regimes have in fact been logical extensions of his doctrines. Of course, Juncker is right that Marx, who died 34 years before the Russian Revolution, was not responsible for the Gulag, and yet his ideas clearly were. So, this article, what this quote is fucking hilarious because it implies the stupidity of this fucking author. It's dialectical and historical materialism by fucking Joseph Stalin. Then the thing that makes me die seeing that is fucking Stalin didn't create the Gulag, you dipshit. It was Lenin. Like, and it implies that this has nothing to do with the Gulag. It has nothing to do with socialism. I mean, it does because it's dialectical materialism. But I mean, like, it has nothing to do with a command economy. It has nothing to do with the establishment of the Gulag. Like, it has nothing to do with economics. Which the philosophical aspects of Marx's theory aren't even the meat of his theory, in my opinion. It's his economic analysis of capitalism. That's the most important part. And it just shows how stupid this guy is. Not stupid, but just malinformed. Just these ridiculous opinions based on like the two socialist countries he knows minus Cuba. Like, and get ready, he's gonna mention Mao soon. In his landmark 3-volume study, Main Currents on Marxism, the Polish philosopher, that guy, I'm gonna skip this paragraph just because I've never read this guy's books and I don't really know who he is, so I can't really say much, so I'm just gonna skip that. Um, okay. Um, for his part, Xi views China's economic development over the past few decades as cast iron proof of Marxism's continued validity. But if anything, it is exactly the other way around. Remember that it was the China of pure communism, whatever that means, that produced the famine and terror of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Mao's decision to deprive farmers of their land and entrepreneurs of their firms had predictably disastrous results, and the Communist Party of China has since abandoned that doctrinal approach. Under Mao's successor Deng Xiaoping, the CPC launched China's great economic opening up. After 1978, it began to restore private ownership and permit entrepreneurship, and the results have been nothing short of spectacular. If China's development is being held back by anything today, it is the remnants of Marxism that are still visible in inefficient state-owned enterprises and the repression of dissent. China's centralized single-party system is simply incompatible with a modern and diverse society. 200 years after Marx's birth, it is certainly wise to reflect on his intellectual legacy. We should do so not in celebration, however, but in to inoculate our open societies against the totalitarian temptation that lurks in his false theories. Um, yeah. So, God, China's centralized single party. Okay, basically it's just more of the same shit. It ignores that Maoist theories and Marxism Leninism are definitely going to look different, especially because they explain how to achieve socialism. They're going to look different than Marx's ideology, at least to some extent. And he ignores and is failing to separate that. He fails to even recognize that there are non-Marxist socialists like anarchists or even ancoms who are influenced by Marx's ideology. Like, he fails to recognize that there are libertarian socialists, I would consider myself one, that would prefer a more decentralized approach. But however, it ignores the context that the justification, for instance, of Stalin's socialism in one country and like other Marxism-Leninist um, socialist societies to be so closed off and one party and all that shit, a closed vanguard. The justification for that, barring wanting to be a dictatorship, is because if you don't do that, if you don't centralize heavy, according to these socialists, then the Western imperialists will overthrow your government, which they do. They fucking do. And he ignores that. Because of course he does. Like, of course Carl Bildt does. Like, why the fuck wouldn't he? Like, he doesn't want to produce a nuanced opinion on Marx, or maybe say like, hey, Marxist societies, they had some problems, but there are good things in his writing. That in my opinion, like, I have bias because I am a Marxist, but anyone, I feel like, could read Marx, even if they don't agree with what he says, and get a lot out of it. My friend who is a Georgist, a little bit of a, I guess you could call him a neoliberal if you want to kind of strawman his ideology a little bit, but even him, he agrees with Marx to some extent with some of what Marx says, especially about like exploitation and about private property, the private property question. He does agree with him heavily, and so it's like I feel like anyone could read Marx, and if they were genuinely going into it and find something new, like that's fucking just going to be the case. And Carl Bildt, although he up here claimed he cites Anti-Düring, it's evident that he hasn't read Anti-Düring. He doesn't really quote Engels when he talks about withering away of the state. Like, you shouldn't, obviously anybody watching this video is going to expect this article to be shit. However, I've read good criticisms of Marx. I've watched good criticism of Marx. So it's like, it's just garbage. Fucking garbage.